This is a review of an Albion Caithness, or at least my attempted one. Now this is not going to be the most useful review I've ever done because this sword is regrettably not sharp. I don't study HEMA, Historic European Martial Arts, and my observations about this sword are going to be more directed toward overall aesthetics, handling, build quality, and some general observations. Still, I would attest that this sword review should be useful to some folks that are prospective buyers of both the sharp and dull versions, because they share some very striking similarities, as in everything but a sharp edge. I would also ask that you keep in mind that this sword is secondhand and may not be representative of a new version from Albion if you ordered one today. A few things about this particular piece. The blade itself is an Oakshot Type 12 design. The hilt and guard have a design that you don't often see in production swords, but that should come as no surprise. Albion is somewhat known for making historic designs that you're unlikely to see elsewhere, at least outside of custom projects. This sword is designed to look like a 15th century Scottish sword. The design came from historic sculptures and carvings made in that period. Some people call them effigies, but I always hear effin' orgies when people say that. That's just me though. So sculptures and carvings, that's what I went with. The pommel is almost Viking-like in appearance, and that's probably because it's kind of Viking-like in appearance. Supposedly, Scotland and some Norse Viking-esque folks had some dealings and some interminglings back in the way back when, and some words and some things, but basically it's kind of Scottish with a Viking influence because it's supposed to be. That said, the shape of the pommel does not make it a wrist killer. The gentle curving slope allows you to smash things without it jamming into your wrist and making you feel silly. Now, there's supposed to be some techniques to use Viking-type swords, like a handshake grip or some other ideas and notions. I was able to swing this sword brutishly without hurting myself, which is good for me. The peen on this one is well done by most standards, but not very well done by Albion standards, if that makes sense. And that's because you can see where the peen actually comes in or is made on the pommel itself. The detail on the pommel looks cool to some, and some folks say that it looks like a middle finger giving you the bird. However, I would say that it's hard to clean. You can see that this one has gotten some pitting over time, and it's kind of a bitch to clean this little thing out, at least if you want to use it for anything, or even if it hangs on the wall. Now, Albion swords are made from some sort of carbon steel material, and as I recall from speaking with one of the folks that works at Albion's, he says his swords are guaranteed to rust, and if they don't, you can return them for one that will. The crossguard also has a cool look. They look like simple bars, but they have a nice shape to them that's a little bit more complicated than a simple rounded bar. It's actually octagonal in shape. The upward angle does not make it hard to grip, and it still functions to stop your hand from moving up. It might also be easy to trap a sword if that's really the thing that you're going for. Why they're pitched up at an angle, I don't know, other than it looks cool. There's probably some functional reason for it, but it's beyond my comprehension. There is a gap between part of the crossguard and where the fuller enters the blade in crossguard-esque area. Most of the crossguard is tight, but not that one part. There's also a small 1 millimeter size gap between the crossguard and the sharp of the edge. It makes me wonder what happens when water gets down there. It's hard to clean, for sure, but I don't know if it would rust or be problematic. The blade is a Type 12. It has a fuller that runs up 2/3 of the blade. The sword is a gentle distal taper, meaning that it's thicker at the base than at the tip. The sword is also relatively flexible. You can see from some of the video that it wiggles and wobbles and waggles as I whack water bottles with it. That was quite a tongue twister. The blade is dull, but even though the blade is dull, it has the general profile of one that could be sharp, in that it would likely have a secondary bevel, but it's not a big fat flat edge. Again, a tongue twister. The tip is somewhat wide, and it thrusts well enough, but it's not the kind of tip that's going to pass through gaps well. That has more to do with the style of blade than anything else. Handling-wise, the sword feels great. It's agile, its point control is easy, it's easy to start and stop. It really feels fantastic in the hand. I can't really say much about how it should feel, as I'm not a student of these types of martial arts that would use this sword, and my understanding is admittedly minimal. But it is a cutting blade, and so I believe it should have a little bit of weight towards the point, not so much that it feels clunky, of course, and it should be relatively quick to change directions. It should move around and rapidly move in different directions quickly without making you feel like an asshat. And even though I look like an asshat, I would say that it meets that goal of changing directions quickly and having relatively good point control with enough mass at the tip to make it feel like it could cut through things as that is what it's intended to do. So, thumbs up on the handling side of things. This is a quick look at some of the measurements in comparison to what Albion has registered on their website versus the actual version that I have. And note that they're both 38.5 inches long, however, some of the other dimensions do vary. The blade length is slightly different. The blade width, assumably measured at the base, mine is 2 inches versus slightly above 2 inches, and there are minor differences in the center of percussion and center of balance. Additionally, note that the blade is supposed to measure at 2 pounds 8.4 ounces, and mine is 2 pounds 11 ounces, a little heavier than what is noted on Albion's website. Nevertheless, the blade is very lively, but that difference in ounces can make a really profound difference on handling and how they feel. So it's a little bit wider a variation than I would expect from Albion, but then again, it is only 3 ounces, and that is not a lot, especially if you snort cocaine, I guess. No, probably not. That's not something. The other thing that I will note as well, a distal taper. This was not published on Albion's website, but it is an important note. You can see that the thickness at the guard is 0.21 inches, and the thickness near the tip, I measured near where that secondary slope begins, is 0.09, so it loses over half of its thickness as it gradually distally tapers down, and that may account for some of the profound flexibility near the tip, as well as the very lively feeling it gives you. I'm going to attempt to answer the question, is this sword worth it? And forgive my exhausted appearance, because I've tried to do this. This is my 71st take trying to answer this type of question, and for whatever reason I just keep rambling on about stuff that I like about the sword, and I don't really come to a coherent point. So here's me attempting to do that. Do I think it's worth it? Yes. It's $1,023. The fact that that is a lot of money is certainly not lost on me. But it rings, so it's got to be worth $1,000, right? No, not quite. The reason I would say yes, even though I'm not necessarily a European sword guy and don't know what the hell I'm doing with it, why would I answer that question? It's more or less based on, one, if you're looking for a Type 12 sword, this is a pretty good execution of a Type 12 sword. It's flexible, it feels a little bit weighty at the tip, it handles the way it's supposed to, at least the way I would think it's supposed to, in that it's easy for me to change directions and move around with it, but it still feels weighty enough for me to smack things with it, and it's flexible enough that it doesn't seem to break or get stuck or get fucked up. Anyway, the execution of the Type 12 sword itself is good. Also, if I look at the lines on the sword, hopefully you're getting some of this in the camera, they're clean, the planes of the blade are flat, and even though it's made on a CNC machine to start, at least I believe so, there's a lot of skill that goes in grinding this sword to make the planes as clean as they are and the lines as nice as they are. The fact that that's done and well executed makes me think that price-wise this should be a little bit more money. The next thing is that you really can't find something like this. Maybe I'm wrong. If you guys know of another option on the table that's less expensive, go ahead and throw it in the comments below. But I don't think there's a whole lot of things that give you this kind of Viking European mix type. I don't see a lot of swords in the market that look like this that compare to it. Now there's a lot of Type 12 swords blade wise, but there's not necessarily a lot of things that look like this on the hilt assembly. So if you want something that looks like this, which assumably you do if you're buying it, your options are pretty limited outside of doing some sort of custom project. Now, the sword is not flawless. There was a small gap here, 1 millimeter, but that's not necessarily anything that I'm going to complain about a lot. It doesn't make the sword not functional. Also, the peen is just a personal preference. A lot of the Albion swords that I've seen, you can't even tell where the peen is. On this one, you kind of can, and that's because the shape is somewhat hard to manage and is rusted slightly. Well, it's probably not. It's probably just that you can tell where the peen is. Still, those are very minor things, and for how the sword feels, for how the lines are, for how it looks, how kind of uncommon it is, and the work that went into it, I don't think $1,000 is out of the question. I think it's a pretty fair price to pay, and so I would say you're not getting ripped off with the money, and if you like it, this is a pretty damn solid option for it. I hope that that's concise enough for me to digest. It's hard to condense it even to that much. I think the sword is good. Kudos, Albion. Before I get any more distractions, I'm going to wrap up by saying this sword from Albion is pretty cool, as are most of the swords that I've gotten to handle from Albion. Most of them don't suffer from any kind of major glaring issues, and you pay for that type of thing. So generally speaking, Albions are pretty good, and this one doesn't really seem to be any kind of exception. I'm going to wrap it up now by saying cheers, and thanks for watching. Yeah, damn it, rambling. I think, hell yeah, it's, fuck, I rambled again. Start recording and the wife wants to make some stuff, the daughter wants to play video games, and I can't. It's okay, no. It's not as though the blender gets picked up. Sword, cool, and stuff, interesting. Shit, one more. Oh, so close to done. Had pretty good luck with, damn it. Sorry. Thanks, babe. Alright, I'm gonna try again.